Hi everyone and welcome to the Sophos XG Academy 2021. My name is Alexander Hägglund and I'm with the sales engineering team here at Sophos. In this session we'll be covering the migration process from the SG Firewall, otherwise known as the Sophos UTM, to the XG Firewall. Now, before we move into the migration process, I just want to cover one of the key highlights on why you should be moving to the next generation platform. Specifically, the Extreme architecture or the new deep packet inspection engine, which offers superior SSL visibility and increased performance when decrypting the traffic that passes through the XG firewall. By leveraging the Sophos Labs threat intelligence, we offer better protection against ransomware, advanced threats, and zero-day malware. We also have the FastPath technology, which offers intelligent offloading, which can increase performance. Last but not least, we have the route-based VPN, which offers better flexibility over the policy-based VPN in the Sophos UTM. We will be covering these in more depth in the other sessions, so don't miss out on that. Now, in this session, we will be covering migration of the configuration from the SG Firewall to the XG Firewall using the Migration Assistant tool. We will also be looking at post-editing of the configuration, and we will also be looking at support during migration of the configuration, because we appreciate that it might be circumstances that require some help when it comes to migrating the configurations, problems that may arise, etc. And it's also worth thinking ahead and planning ahead and considering if you really need to do a migration of the configuration. With that, I mean that you might have obsolete firewall rules and policies, host objects that you're not using, and other kinds of configuration directives that might not be carried over to the XG firewall. And in those scenarios, it might be worth just starting from scratch, and that might give you a better exercise to learn the new ways of the XG firewall. Now, if you still want to go ahead and configure the XG firewall based on the SG firewall configuration and the migration of the configuration, we offer a tool called the Migration Assistant. The Migration Assistant is a tool that was specifically developed for partners and enables you to carry over certain kinds of configuration from the SG firewall to the XG firewall. There are some caveats which we will be covering in this session, as well as the limitations when it comes to the Migration Assistant tool. And should you need any help during the migration, we have something called the Migration Service Desk. The Migration Service Desk can help answer tough questions if you have any problems with the configuration, as well as helping you configure other kinds of migrations, such as, for example, SonicWall to XG, CyberOwn to XG, as well as the SG to XG migrations. The Migration Service Desk is available to Sophos partners, and you can find the contact information and the specifications on what the Migration Service Desk can help you with in the partner portal. Now, let's take a look at the Migration Assistant and an actual migration of the configuration from the Sophos UTM to the XG Firewall. First of all, let's log into the Sophos UTM to look over the current configuration. Now, as you can see, this is a fully functional UTM with a running configuration, and you can also see that the version of the UTM is 9.7.05-3. So this is one of the later versions of the Sophos UTM. You can also see that it's running a current configuration, and I have a couple of modules configured at the moment, and I will go over in detail which of these will be migrated over to the XG Firewall. One of the things that will be migrated over is the authentication servers, such as, for example, Active Directory or Radius. We also have a couple of interfaces configured, and these will be migrated over to the XG Firewall. As you can see, we also have a network configured using DHCP, and these will also be carried over to the XG Firewall. Now, this Sophos UTM has also a web filtering configured, but due to the complexity of the web filtering in the XG Firewall, these policies won't be carried over using the migration assistant. It's one of the things that you need to configure yourself, as well as the application control. Now, the wireless access points and the red servers won't be migrated over to the XG Firewall, and they need to be added one by one to the XG Firewall after the migration is configured. Red clients specifically are not carried over due to the fact that they are certificate-based. We also have a web server configured, and they won't be carried over either to the XG Firewall due to the fact that they are certificate-based. We have a IPsec tunnel configured using a pre-shared key, which is up and running and configured in the Sophos UTM. Now, this will be carried over to the XG Firewall. However, had it been a digital certificate configured IPsec tunnel, it would not have been carried over to the XG Firewall. And this is due to the fact that nothing based on certificates will be carried over to the XG Firewall. Remote SSL tunnels will not be carried over because they are certificate-based. Now, what you need to do before you start the migration is creating a new backup of your current configuration. That is what we'll be using in order to migrate configuration in the Migration Assistant tool. Start out by creating a new backup and a fresh backup of the current configuration. Now, you can go ahead and download that to your local machine and make sure that you do not encrypt the configuration. That will render it unable to be imported into the Migration Assistant. Here you can see the configuration, which I have downloaded to my machine. Now let's go ahead and look at the Sophos Migration Assistant and when we import the configuration in order to make it ready for migration. First, you need to give it a name. And then you need to choose your file which you recently downloaded from the Sophos UTM, e.g. the backup file. Now you can click on Start the Migration. However, the Migration Assistant, being a beta as it is, only supports migration configurations from version 9.605-3 and below. This is why you need to do a workaround in order to make the configuration work if it's above that version. So by editing the configuration in Notepad and searching for the string version, you can actually change the version number of the firmware in the configuration file. Now, we have chosen to name it 9.503.001, and that is an existing version of a Sophos UTM in a previous version. Now, when you go ahead and save this one, this configuration file will not be able to be imported into the Sophos UTM anymore as we have changed the hash value. with the edited configuration, you can now go ahead and import it into the Sophos Migration Assistant. As you can see, the migration is now starting because we applied the workaround to the configuration file. And you can see a progress bar, and we also show you all the items that are migrated, as well as any eventual exceptions that you need to handle yourself after the migration of the configuration. And we will be looking at that in the post-editing of the configuration. As you can see, 2 exceptions have been found, and these are objects that needs to be configured before finalizing the migration of the configuration. So, as soon as the migration has been finalized and the policies and settings have been imported into the Migration Assistant, we can also view the dropped entities and the exceptions that needs to be altered in order to finalize the migration. Now, in the dropped UTM configuration, you can see everything that hasn't been carried over into the current configuration that we are using to import into the XG Firewall. This will also give you better visibility on what you need to configure in order to complete the configuration. You can also download the dropped UTM configuration, so you can view it later in order to cross-reference that with your current configuration in the XG Firewall. Now, before we move on to finalizing the migration, we need to handle the exceptions that occur during migration. This can, for example, be cryptographic algorithms that haven't been carried over or doesn't exist in the XG Firewall. And you can also choose to accept suggestions that are given to you using the Migration Assistant in order to automate the process. Here I am accepting the suggestion provided to me by the XG Migration Assistant. But we still have 4 exceptions to go, so we need to take care of these. So we go into the first one for the L2TP connection, and you can see in the right-hand side what needs to be changed in order to finalize this setting. So if we go down, we see that the encryption algorithm doesn't match up with the current one in the XG Firewall. So we need to change that to a value that actually exists. Go ahead and click on Save and continue to the next one. So here we have the IPsec connection, and we can see that there's a parameter in the interface section that doesn't match up to the XG Firewall. So we need to change that to an external interface in order for the IPsec tunnel to work. We also need to change the cryptographic algorithm in order to match the configuration in the XG Firewall. When you migrate the radio server, you also need to have a group name attribute. that value doesn't exist in the Sophos UTM or is optional, but is required in the XG Firewall. When it comes to the Active Directory configuration, you need to specify a NetBIOS name, because that is mandatory in the XG Firewall configuration in order for an Active Directory connection to be made. You also need to specify a domain name for the running domain that you are connecting to. Now, when all of the exceptions have been handled, you can go ahead and download the logs for all the changes that have been made into the configuration, and also what has been done in the Migration Assistant, and all the changes that have been made. When you have saved them down to your hard drive, you can open them in Excel and view them later in order to determine what has been done to the configuration. Now you can see that we have a complete configuration that has been migrated, and now we can go ahead and edit the configuration. So this is the post-editing part of the configuration. This will load up an interface of an actual XG firewall with a default configuration template, as well as the imported configuration directives from the Sophos UTM migration that you configured. Now, as you can see, we have the VPN tunnel, which has been migrated. We also have the settings, which are defaulted from the XG firewall. You can also view the authentication service that was migrated over. Here we have the Active Directory and the radio server. Now, if you want to add any firewall rules, you can go ahead and click on Add Firewall Rule. This will take you to the configuration pane for the firewall rules. And in this case, we're creating a LAN to WAN configuration for FTP traffic. Go ahead and specify the source zone. And the source network, as this is based on an internal network that was carried over using the host object. We are directing the traffic to the WAN, and we're specifying the service as FTP. We don't want to match any known users, and we want to scan the traffic for malware in the FTP protocol. And we also specify a IPS policy. And as you can see, the masquerading is in place, and I want to log the firewall traffic. Now, this firewall rule is added to the configuration that you have migrated and will be carried over to the actual XG firewall configuration when we import it. So here you can specify the rules that you didn't get with you in the configuration migration from the Sophos UTM and finalize the migration. Now, when you click on Download Migration, you will get the current configuration that you have migrated, as well as any changes that were made after that. Now you are ready to import it into the XG Firewall. So we have covered the Migration Assistant and how you configure and migrate a configuration from the SG or the Sophos UTM to the XG Firewall. We have also looked at the post-editing of the configuration, as well as how you can finalize the configuration for importation into the XG. If you need any more information, please visit one of these links for example, the Migration Service Assistant or the migration documentation. Now, there's also an API which you can use to programmatically configure the XG Firewall using, for example, Python or XML, and import configuration from, for example, other vendors or current XG firewalls or even XG firewalls. For more information, please visit the link in the PDF or the PowerPoint. Now, the next session will be covering the post-migration steps in more depth, and that will be handled by my colleague Christoph Litzbach. And if you have any further concerns or if you need help with the migration, I suggest that you contact your account manager to set you up with the professional services team, as they are experts into handling migrations and setting up XG firewalls. Don't miss out on the other sessions which will be covered in this Sophos XG Academy 2021. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please contact globaltraining@sophos.com, and thank you very much.